It's not always easy to find a full community to practice with in mindfulness, especially if you're not used to going online or would rather be in person. But self-directed mindfulness is also a thing and can have benefits for you in your life. Let's talk with our guest today to learn a little bit more about what the research says about it.
Our guests today are Alessandro Sparacio. Welcome to the podcast. Good to see you.
Thank you for the invite.
And Hans, thank you for your patience on this. IJzerman, thank you so much for being here, Hans.
Thank you for the invite. It's really my pleasure.
Really appreciate seeing both of you for this. And there are a lot of co-authors on this paper. I just know that Alessandro is the lead. Hans is here representing the rest of the crew on this. So appreciate you spending time with us today to talk about this paper, which really caught my eye. But before we get started talking about that, I just want to hear from each of you very briefly. What got you interested in mindfulness in the first place? And Alessandro, maybe we can start with you on that question.
So I was a practitioner of mindfulness and really loved doing meditation. And then I started a PhD on stress regulation at the University of Grenoble. So I had the opportunity to study mindfulness more in depth. And that is the beginning of the story. So basically, I studied during my PhD the available evidence of various stress regulation strategies, and I decided to focus on mindfulness, but not on all the mindfulness intervention, but on the intervention that can be self-administered, that have various advantages compared to traditional protocols such as mindfulness-based stress reduction, because they are quite short, they are accessible, and they are not really expensive. In fact, you can meditate with a smartphone application, with a book, or with audio files. So that's basically how everything began on my end. So
thank you. And we're going to talk more about the accessibility issue because there's so many layers to your research about that. And Hans, how about for you? What first got you into mindfulness?
Yeah, so my brief answer is really Alessandro. So before Alessandro was recruited on this PhD project, one of his other supervisors and I, Gabriela Gigaboy, and then later on Ivan Ropovic, we wrote a grant proposal to really study more the theoretical mechanisms behind stress regulation. And then we were doing interviews, and Alessandro's CV caught our eye. We started working with Alessandro, and of course, when you start such a project, Alessandro and I started exploring what should be the direction of the PhD, and it was very clear that Alessandro was very much interested in mindfulness. So we wanted to study multiple short-term and cheap and accessible intervention mechanisms, and mindfulness was one of them for his systematic reviews. I have to admit, actually, that before the project started, I was a skeptic. But good data has swayed me in another direction.
Great. Thank you, Hans. And being a skeptic is a perfect place to start. It's not denialism. It's how do I understand what it is you're talking about? So I'm totally on board with that healthy skepticism. And I'm wondering, Alessandro, if you might share a little bit about how you all decided together what the structure of this study would be like, and maybe what you landed on.
Yeah, sure. So we started at the beginning of my PhD with a meta-analysis of self-administered mindfulness to know about the state of the literature for what concerns self-administered mindfulness and stress. So basically what we have done in a meta-analysis is gathering all the articles that answered our research question that was basically, is self-administered mindfulness really effective in reducing stress level of participants? And basically what we found is that the literature was not in a good shape, because the majority of the study had a really low sample size or had other problems. For instance, they didn't follow pre-registration, which allows some flexibility in the analysis or in the experimental design. And this basically expose studies to bias and to inflated effects. So when I found these conclusions, I was kind of sad, because I was like thinking that mindfulness can be beneficial for people that are stressed. But when you find studies with low quality, it doesn't mean that if you don't find an effect, it's because the effect is not there. Could be that we needed to improve the rigor of the studies on mindfulness. So that's why we decided to start this large multi-site project in which we wanted to test 4 different self-administered mindfulness exercises and the reduction on stress levels. In order to do this, basically we consulted some meditation expert. We did a survey online, and based on their answers, we decided to draw a list of exercises to be tested in the multi-site. And these exercises are really typical of the mindfulness practices, because our body scan, loving kindness meditation, mindful breathing, and mindful walking. And we tested those exercises against a control condition in which participants had to listen to a story that was matching the mindfulness exercises for what concerns the word count and the duration of the mindfulness tracks. So we started this big project. We asked for collaboration around the world, and we had 37 sites and 61 researchers that agreed to collaborate for the data collection. And I built my own experiment that was embedded into a single link, in which there was basically the listening of the mindfulness tract, and also the questionnaires that people would have responded after the listening of the mindfulness exercises.
And what's interesting here is what I find fascinating about this, and you raised so many wonderful layers about research within mindfulness. There are over 12,000 studies since 1980 around mindfulness, and there's a whole bunch of junk science in there. There's a whole bunch of good science in there as well, but some of the limitations are, as you said, small sample sizes is one of the challenges, because we have a history of programs like MBSR, MBCT having traditionally small class sizes. You don't usually have an MBSR program that has thousands of people taking it at the same time. So that introduces a lot of variability. So what was wonderful about this research is you had over 2,000 participants, over 30 locations, nearly 40 different locations. It was pre-registered. All these good layers were added into this. And it was a bit different. It wasn't a particular program and its effects on stress. It was, what do these different meditations do? What are their effects? And I'm really interested in digging in a little bit more to the results. But Hans, I want to hear from you too. Was there anything you wanted to add just about the structure of this study?
That's a good question. Maybe before going into the structure of the study, what I wanted to highlight is also kind of Alessandro's journey going from a meta-analysis to this multi-site study, because for me, this is really how science is supposed to work. You know, because mindfulness is a very popular topic, it then also means, like you said, there will be sometimes some low quality and perhaps some high quality studies, but that also elicits some skepticism in people like me, because when a research area is popular, there will be a lot of bad science around it. And that's why it was very good for Alessandro to make an observation of the literature and say, yeah, you know, this is the state of the evidence. And now we need to make sure we fix that and we make an improvement. What perhaps Alessandro has mentioned in other places sometimes when talking about the study, I think we were very lucky to rely, to stand on the shoulder of giants. You know, there were many different other people that have contributed to thinking about the infrastructure of multi-site studies. So these are organizations like the Psychological Science Accelerator that really developed the infrastructure for such projects. Alessandro relied on a couple other PhD students that we worked with that were working on very similar studies. So that meant that he could very quickly mobilize a lot of resources to put this study together. And that's why the study was, I think, so effective, because it was really a team effort from people that weren't directly in the team, but then also a number of different people that contributed to this. Maybe one of the other things you were talking about, of course, more sustained mindfulness. This is not about more sustained mindfulness, about longer term practice. This is really about a one-time, one-shot interaction. And all the participants that took part, they were not practitioners of mindfulness. Because it was, it was really to show, like, can this work without you having any prior kind of experience?
Great. Thank you for that. And that's a good segue. Let's talk a little bit about the results, maybe just a few highlights of some of the things that you found out of this study. Alessandro, tell us what showed up.
Yeah, sure. What we found is basically that every mindfulness exercise we tested were more effective than the control condition in reducing stress levels of participants. And so this is a really good result. It's really promising. However, there are some limitations that must be taken into account when we see these results. So, for instance, we only relied on self-reported measures that can be not really sensitive sometimes in measuring stress. So it would have been good to measure stress also with some physiological assessment, but given the multi-site context, this would have been really tricky and not easy to implement. And also, another thing is that we could not really disentangle true effect of mindfulness and expectation effect. That is basically a sort of, it's similar to the placebo effect that you can have when you take like a medicine. You just feel better just because like you are taking the medicine. Even if at the end of the day, the medicine does nothing, you feel better. So we could not really disentangle like what is the expectation effect and what is the positive effect of the mindfulness practice that comes from the active components of mindfulness. So the result is really promising because we had a really high sample size. I think it's the study with the highest sample size so far. But still, it's important to keep in mind that there are some limitations to say in this study, and we are already planning a follow-up multi-site study in order to solve these issues.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up because for those who are watching this, it may be, if this is just self-report, it doesn't matter. I'm like, well, it does. It's an indication of potential effects that people may run into. And also, it's expensive to put people into an fMRI machine, for example. And doing that for over 2,000 people, that would be really tough, not just logistically, but financially. That would be a hard thing to make happen. So I appreciate you sharing some of the limitations on that. And Hans, is there anything you wanted to add a little bit about just the limitations? And then maybe we can dig into a little bit more detail on some of the outcomes, because you had a number of different things that you talked about in the conclusion section.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Alessandro's words, with which I completely agree. But maybe also, I think it's very good that you mentioned the costs. And I think we have to be reminded where we came from. So we start with a meta-analysis that really says, yeah, we don't really have a lot of good evidence in self-administered mindfulness. So is it a wise decision to make a really a labor-intensive and a very expensive study, for example, using physiological measures, fMRI? Not at all. It wouldn't be a wise decision to make such a large investment. So from a cost efficiency perspective, we needed to do this study and to move the needle where even a skeptic as me would be, yeah, okay, this is a good idea. We need to continue with this. So I think this is a really important step in providing at least the probability that it can work, that there's a likely probability that we can take this further, because now it's wise to invest in follow-up studies, because now we have at least that initial evidence that wasn't there based on the meta-analysis. I think the meta-analysis provided sufficient doubt not to continue there. And maybe to also some other follow-up thoughts regarding limitations. So the sample is to some degree restricted, and that's for very similar reasons, because when you run these studies, you need to rely on convenient samples for various reasons, because Otherwise, again, it would be very costly to rely on representative samples, for instance, or to do this study in multiple languages. So there was a conscious choice to focus on English, because then we'd have all the same materials in one language. We didn't have to go through an extensive back translation process. And this is with people that are relatively well off. You know, all these people live in countries where there's kind of a lot of resources. They don't necessarily have to deal with really more severe stress that, you know, may even threaten their, you know, that there may be something related to their survival. So it's a relatively restricted sample, but a good starting point to now go to other samples, to take more intensive measures, and to really work on those follow-up studies.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in, Hans, because the accessibility issue is a big one. That with these kinds of interventions, it's on demand. So it's whenever people are in a moment where they can do this, they can do it from anywhere. They don't need to go to a particular location to get this done. And it's the low cost. There's the accessibility option, has so many different layers to it. You mentioned language as well, and it sounds like that didn't really seem to show any big difference with people who are native speakers and non-native speakers. So Alessandro, I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit about some of the other outcomes that arose from the research.
Yeah, sure. So stress, it was the main outcome of the study. So the design was built basically in order to find an effect or not for what concerns stress. But we also had some other exploratory hypotheses. So for instance, we measured the level of neuroticism of participants. And neuroticism is a personality trait that basically tells how you react to stressors. So if you are high in neuroticism, every single thing make you feel really aroused and stressed. We tested whether people high versus low in neuroticism would have benefit more from the mindfulness exercise, but we didn't find a moderation, probably because, as I said, the sample size was built just to measure if the exercises were reducing stress or not. So in order to test a moderation of neuroticism, probably we would have needed a higher sample size. Also, we tested the moderation of the English language, as you said, but even in this case, we didn't find a different reduction in stress for people that are native English speaker compared to people that are fluent English speaker. So basically, for what concerns the other analyses, we didn't find any differences.
I want to ask one other question, and this is on just a more personal experience level for each of you. Was there anything that came from the results that was surprising to you, or maybe something that you were particularly interested in as one of the results? Alessandro, maybe we can start with you, and then Hans, same question. I want to hear from you on this too.
Well, as I said, I was quite upset after the result of the first meta-analysis. So I was kind of afraid that I would have not found an effect at the end. But I was so relieved when I look at the data, and basically I saw that all these exercises were reducing stress level of participants.
Thank you. And Hans, how about for you? Anything surprising or particularly interesting for you about this work?
I mean, like I said in the beginning, you know, I was a skeptic, and I think for me, it moved the needle towards thinking, yeah, there can be a small difference when you practice these mindfulness interventions on your levels of stress. You know, with the added note that we can disentangle these demand effects, but it's something that we definitely should study. I do think that the effects are relatively small. So if you look at the reduction, it's not that big. But of course, that's okay, because I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that if you practice it more often, that through sustained practice, this can increase. The one thing that I was hoping for, but I knew that we weren't going to be able to study this, is this interaction with personality. because I do think it seems reasonable that for different people, mindfulness may have different consequences. So that's why I also think what people can take away from this research, that they need to still exercise sound judgment, and they can't just rely on this paper to say, yeah, I can do it or I can do it. They really need to observe the effects in their own daily lives. So like Alessandro also said, we have a really large sample size compared to other studies, so more than 2,000 people. But when you try to look at individual differences, the sample sizes that you need to study this are even bigger. So the individual differences are really, really difficult to study. Now, there is one difference. If we can start measuring this more frequently, so there can also be some design choices that we can make in order to get a better control over, kind of the statistical models as a short summary. So that's one thing that I'm particularly interested in, these individual differences and how they can play into experiences of mindfulness.
Yeah, and that'll be a good segue to my last question for each of you. But before I go into that, I want to just really highlight what you're saying here, is that as folks who've been watching this podcast and taking courses with me before know, I say this often, your individual mileage may vary. People are complex. You, the listener or viewer of this podcast right now, are not like anyone else. And so what you encounter in any kind of intervention, whatever it happens to be, physical exercise, mindfulness, whatever it is, the important thing is that your well-being is the most important. And learning how to notice how you're doing and respond appropriately to that. Doesn't mean you're not going to be challenged. Doesn't mean difficulties aren't going to arise. That's kind of the point, is how to work with those. And taking care of yourself is a very big, important part of it. It's one of the reasons why I'm really, really encouraged by seeing raised bars in teacher training and things like that. So thank you for that. And this is the segue. What would you like to see in research coming up in mindfulness? Alessandro, how about for you?
Yeah, I already anticipated the answer for this question, because I would be really interested in looking at how your physiology changes when you are doing mindfulness. So you say that you are less stressed, but what happens to your heart rate variability? That is a physiological biomarker of the stress response. Typically, when you are less stressed, your heart rate variability tends to go up. So this is something that I would really like to see in a multi-site project of mindfulness, but it's work in progress. So
it is, and I know that there's some research around that. I know Eric Laux of Brown University has done exactly that kind of work, but again, not on the scale that you're talking about here. So I'm eager for that as well. And Hans, how about for you? You already said a little bit about that, but maybe other things that you're interested in seeing in research around mindfulness or behavioral change in general, personality.
Yeah, it's getting harder and harder when everybody's already mentioning very good ideas. So, but perhaps, the studies that we typically do in research are around convenience samples around students. But what I could really see is, making the bridge between research and on the one end, and maybe, towards business or mindfulness practitioners on the other end. So that you don't only deal with students in the lab that, of course, they're dealing with real and challenging issues, but that you get a greater variability on the types of stressful experiences that people encounter, so that you expand the range on the types of experience and probably have even more impact. And that is, on the one end, people, that are perhaps at a later stage in life, or people that are from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So that's maybe another direction that I would like to see going in towards.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, for those who are watching this, there are links to the research we've been talking about, a few other things in the description of this episode. I want to thank our guest, Alessandro Sparacio. Alessandro, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the
invite. And Hans IJzerman, thank you for being here as well.
It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for joining, and I always enjoy these conversations about really robust research. So great appreciation to our guest today. And remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. And I'll see you next time on Mindfulness Voyage.